everybody, I'm Pete.
And I'm Ken.
And we just finished a series at our church called Real Good Questions, where we were examining the challenges to Christianity. And throughout the series, we were collecting questions from people from our church community and anybody watching online, knowing that we were going to do this podcast to finish the series. And so today we've got a bunch of questions that we're going to try to answer, or at least provide a response to, or at least, I don't know, go back and forth a little bit about. And so
could be fun.
So you had week one of the series.
I do. I taught, whatever I did it week one, and the question was this one: aren't we better off without religion? Aren't we better off without religion? And I think that's a common kind of feel that a lot of people have. So you have a book out by Christopher Hitchens called God Is Not Great, and the subtitle is basically this: How Religion Poisons Everything. And you can remember all the way back to John Lennon's song called Imagine, when he in there talks about imagine no religion, and then we could live our lives in peace. So there's an idea that that's the case. And I get it, because a lot of people will look to religion, they'll say religion caused wars, it denigrates women, it condones slavery, it's anti-science, crushes diversity, and on people go. So I tried to respond to that by suggesting that if we removed all religion, would we really be living a life of peace? I was keying in off of John Lennon's song. And I suggested, no, we've tried it and it's failed miserably. The French Revolution was a time to get rid of religion, and it did not work well at all. We've got other problems that are bigger than religion. If you just think about wars and the number of wars and how many are caused by religion, it's a very, very small number. Blaming religion for our problems is a little simplistic and naive, because we could say that politics poisons everything, or science poisons everything, or drugs poison everything. Well, there's good drugs and bad drugs, and so on and so forth. And then we talked about many of the blessings that Christianity has brought us, actually. We talked about things like social welfare, founding of hospitals, economics, natural law. We talked about things like architecture and literature and personal hygiene and so on. It actually comes out of Christianity. Started the university movement. And we looked at the blessings too, that it's something that calls us how to better handle our money, about forgiveness and gratitude, and Jesus' teaching on the Mount is pretty incredible. And then I kind of wrapped it up by saying, the problem really isn't religion, the problem is actually people. And Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote the Gulag Archipelago, said, the line between good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, not between political parties either, but right through the middle of every human heart and through all human hearts. And the Bible comes along and calls us out about bad behavior. It's speaking and calling us to live differently, and it's our responsibility to make that happen. And I wrapped everything up by saying there is no doubt that Christianity is guilty of a whole lot of hurtful and shameful and vile actions, but Jesus is not guilty.
That was good. I like that line.
Yeah, it's not his message, it's not his lifestyle, it's not what he called his followers to emulate, and I think that's the key thing to me. And so we have to look at Jesus and see how he really wanted us to live, because, as Pilate said, I can't find any fault in him, and I think that that's really a cool thing. Yeah. So we got very few questions on this one, and that's because I was super clear.
Because he nailed it.
That's what it was.
You nailed it. That's what it means.
Yeah. Actually, there was a comment that was made. I know there is a lot to mention in both the good and the bad that religion has given us, but I do think it's a fail not to mention the residential school crisis of the indigenous people and the role Christianity played in that. And I appreciate that comment, and I do think that is another area where you could look at Christianity and say there's been a failure there, particularly because indigenous residential schools are here in Canada, so this is like on our home turf. So I thank the person for pointing that out. The other question was, if Christians hadn't started things like hospitals, would other people have eventually started them out of need? And I guess the answer would be that, I don't know. I guess it's possible that could have happened, but it didn't happen. And so I think there's something around Christianity saying, love your neighbor, and so on and so forth, that I think draws us in that direction. In fact, Pope Innocent III in 1198 urged wealthy Christians to actually build hospitals in every town. And the oldest hospital is still in existence in Lyon, and it was built in 580 AD. It's interesting that the Roman Emperor Julian, I got this quote here, writing in the 4th century, regretted the progress of Christianity because it pulled people away from the Roman gods. And what he was talking about was that the Christian faith has been, he writes, especially advanced through the loving service rendered to strangers and through their care for the burial of the dead. It is a scandal that there's not a single Jew who is a beggar, and that the godless Galileans care not only for their own poor, but for ours as well, while those who belong to us look in vain for the help that we should render them. In other words, Christians were automatically stepping over the line to help people who were hurting all along as part of the pattern of what it means to follow Jesus.
And it's a good question because it's a thought experiment to say, well, wouldn't we just have ended up here, like in 2021, with all the social structures that we have? Wouldn't we have just gotten there without religion? And when you look at what the early Christians did and how they were known for these acts of love, caring for the poor, going to like finding the abandoned babies on roadsides, picking up these babies, you have to say, well, I don't know where we would have gotten by 2021, but in ancient Rome, they hadn't gotten there. Like they weren't in their godless or pantheon of God society thinking we should be taking care of the widow and the orphan and the refugee. They weren't doing that, and Christians were the ones that introduced that.
Absolutely, in great contradiction to the culture around them. They acted in love towards the unloved and the disenfranchised. A big part of what Christianity was about, for sure. Yeah. Cool. So, and that leads to our next real good question.
Yeah, so week 2 talked about the Bible, and I kind of went around. There's so much you can talk about the Bible, and I was trying to think of how should I phrase this question, like what will get us to the point maybe that might be helpful to people. And this is how I ended up phrasing the question for week 2. Why would I allow the Bible to be authoritative in my life? So there's so many different places where you could look for authority. You could look to yourself. You could be the authority. You could look to other religions. Why would you pick the Bible to be authoritative in your life? And so I kind of broke down that we begin with Jesus, that Jesus is ultimately the one who if you want to be a Christian, if you want to be his follower, then he's the one with the authority. Yep. And so it kind of begins with you've got to make that move to, well, I want to become his follower. I'm at least interested in investigating Christianity. And so you begin with Jesus, and Jesus transitions and hands all of authority to his disciples. And then they start the church, and the church eventually hands us the Bible. And so if you kind of see that as a progression from Jesus, you get Jesus, the apostles, the church, the Bible, that to say that I want the Bible to be authoritative is really saying I want Jesus to be authoritative, and I believe that the way that he's chosen to be authoritative or to speak to me most normatively is through the Bible. Right. And so I try to kind of help people make that move that may feel weird around, like, we have a book, and it's kind of like a magical book that we just read and interpret and get it back to, ultimately we want to follow Jesus. Right. And we think that his spirit is at work the most as we read this book. And so I talked a little bit about can we trust the authenticity of it, and often you hear the attack using the telephone game argument, and I've heard that this gets used a lot in university settings to like kind of debunk Christianity in the Bible, and do the little experiment of like I'm going to tell one student like a long story, and then they pass it around, and by the time it gets back around, the story's completely changed, and that type of argument often gets used against the Bible to say, how do you know that this book was written on leaves or whatever, and then passed for thousands of years? How can we trust that it's the same thing? And actually used a video in the teaching. You did. That maybe we could link to that in this podcast in the comments below. But the video just really succinctly showed us how there are thousands of manuscripts of these early documents, how they are recorded early to the date of the original, and how there are very few copying errors, and amongst those copying errors, there's no doctrinal differences. So there's no copying errors like, this one says Jesus rose from the dead, this one says he didn't. Like it's nothing like that. It's like just minor little errors or changes, but they don't affect doctrine. And then ultimately talked about what it means that the Bible's God-breathed, and that God seems to always want to be in this mysterious partnership with humans. And then we even find this as we talk about Jesus, that Jesus is fully God and fully man. And so one of the ways I've thought has been helpful to me to think about the Bible is that it's fully God-breathed, and yet it's fully man, like man comes out of our historical context and our creativity and the Spirit working in us. And so you kind of hold those two together. And so that's kind of how I try to bring people through. And so we got some questions around this. The first one had to do with, what about the authority of the Old Testament? And I think I touched on this in the sermon. So I'll give my quick answer, and then I'd be interested if you have anything to build on it. But basically, it's because Jesus and his followers look to the Old Testament as authoritative. They're constantly quoting it and showing you that their whole worldview is always reaching back, saying the beginning of the story is the Old Testament. To make sense of what Jesus has done, you need the beginning of the story. I was thinking about, it would be like to say that the Old Testament isn't authoritative would be like saying, I love the Lord of the Rings, but I only like the last book. I only like the Return of the King. Like, you need the first 2 books. Like, it's a story. And so the Bible's telling a story of which Jesus is the fulfillment of, and the Old Testament is the beginning of that story.
Yeah, I would agree completely. I think that's a great point. I think the other thing that's really cool about the Old Testament is that you get to see this prophetic. So the Old Testament took a lot longer to write than the New Testament. We're talking probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000 years, 900 years from the time Genesis is written until we get to the last book, Malachi. And what's cool about the Old Testament is that you've got these prophetic utterances about the arrival of Jesus. And everybody knows that the Old Testament wraps up about 4 centuries before Jesus is even born. And yet in the Old Testament, you've got these prophetic announcements about Jesus being born in Bethlehem, Micah 5:2. It's very clear about that he's going to be sold for 30 pieces of silver or betrayed for that he's going to, just a whole bunch of those prophetic announcements, Psalm 22, Isaiah 53, and so on, which are clearly predictive of Jesus, which link the two together. So you have the announcement from the Old Testament into the New, and then there's this linking that takes place. So I think it just verifies the fact that it belongs, that it's part and parcel of that. Because the Old Testament is really also all about Jesus, which is really cool.
Right, there's such a harmony between the whole thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So the next question that we got, and there's a couple questions around this, but basically it was, why does the Catholic Bible include more books? And then along with that, how does the Apocrypha fit in? And why is it included in some Bibles but not all? So just to catch you up, in case this is like, what are you guys talking about? Like if you're from the Protestant tradition, if you've ever wandered into a Catholic church, or maybe you found yourself in a mass for some reason or another, maybe a wedding or a funeral, and you were opening up the book in the Bible, you'd notice there's books in here I've never seen before. And so we call those the Apocrypha.
Yes.
And so I'm not super up on this, but I did a little bit of research to kind of, so maybe feel free to correct anything that I'm wrong, because you may have, but basically the word Apocrypha means that there's an obscurity around the origin of these books. And so there are books in the Old Testament, or in the pre-Jesus era, I guess, that were written later. So there's kind of what we have as the Old Testament canon, and then there's 7 other books that were written in Greek first. And so because of that, there's a bit of an obscurity around who wrote these books and should they be held as authoritative as the rest of the books. And for the first 1,500 years of the church, which is the Roman Catholic Church, like before the Reformation, they were included. And I'm not sure if they were held as at the same level or not, but they were included in the canon. And then Luther comes along and he says these books should be held as in a different category. So he doesn't say these books are bad or they're problematic. He just says they're not at the same level. And so he actually says they're good for reading, but they shouldn't be held as like holy scripture.
Right.
And so they eventually then, I guess, are removed from the official canon. And Luther actually has New Testament books that he made the same argument for, but we ended up keeping those. So Hebrews, Jude, James, and Revelation. Okay. Luther had problems with all of those, but somehow we ended up keeping those. So maybe that, like, if you've never heard of these sort of things, you're like, what are we talking about? I didn't realize that there was so much. So it's just another important thing to realize that God doesn't hand us a book, right? God is active in human history, and humans are recording this filled with his spirit. And then we as a church, as a community, have to make discernments about which books are faithful to what God's been doing and accurately testify to what he's doing and who he is, and which books aren't. And how do we... And so there's a bit of a messiness of community and history that is at play.
Yeah. I think the other thing about the Apocrypha is that the Jews never accepted them. So you have all these... So the Hebrew Old Testament is written by Jews, and it's in Hebrew originally, and they just never accepted those, and somehow these other people, it wasn't. Yeah, so that's basically what happens there, and I think it's important to know that. And as you're saying, I mean, there's some really cool stuff in there. I like 1st and 2nd Maccabees, for example, which is a bit of a history of what takes place between Malachi and the book of Matthew. And it's all about, the Maccabean revolt and all that sort of thing. And I know apparently one guy was going to make a big movie out of it, and I was hoping he was going to. I think it was Mel Gibson or something, and he's backed away from doing it. He wanted to do a movie on the Maccabees, which I think would be really cool.
Because it gives you a picture of what a failed Messiah looks like, right? Like, and why when Jesus died, they would have thought, well, just another. We've seen this before. We try the revolt and it doesn't work, and then we go back looking for another Messiah. And
there were certainly a lot of writings. The Apocrypha, the Pseudepigrapha are another kind of category of that as well. They're false writings, pseudographe, pseudepigrapha, that were around as well. And there were a lot of other writings that were happening, but these books are the ones that we've settled on, and there's a number of reasons around that that higher criticism kind of stuff that's way over my head. But It's a great question, though, but I think a very relevant one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then I'll just read this question, and we've kind of already touched on it, but could the Bible have been altered over the last few thousand years? How do we know it's still accurate to the way it was originally written? And so I'll just go back to the manuscript evidence.
Yeah.
Like, there's actually evidence. I mean, we have manuscripts from all these different centuries, and you can look and see that the earliest manuscripts line up with the later manuscripts. And so that's, I mean, historically, that's just fantastic evidence if you're going to compare that to other ancient works.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, the evidence is off the charts.
It is, yeah.
Sure.
And hopefully we'll be able to link that video, because if you didn't see it, it's
cool.
Really helpful. So that leads to another real good question.
So the next question in our Real Good Question series was, isn't Christianity anti-science? So isn't Christianity against science or science against Christianity? Isn't there kind of like this war going on?
Obviously.
Obviously.
Right?
Yeah.
Obviously. It seems like it.
Yeah, because there's many people who believe you can't put science and Christianity together. I've talked with them, I've interacted with them, and I get it. That's the word on the street. But I want to suggest, I suggested some other things when I was teaching this. Number one, the Bible and science are actually friends. And we believe that both nature and the Bible itself have been written by God, ultimately authored by God. He created the universe, and he wrote the book through people, so they can't be in conflict with one another. For the most part, they're actually dealing with different realms, and where there is an overlap, and science speaks to the same issue, it's very, very tiny, very, very small. And because God created both, and God is consistent, then they really can't be in conflict. So science, correctly understood, cannot contradict the Bible, and the Bible, correctly understood, cannot contradict science. When we do find apparent contradictions, I believe that's what they are, apparent. Mm-hmm. And our belief is that the Bible and science, the study of nature, cannot contradict one another because they're authored by the same source, which is God. And that's the presupposition that I have in my talk, in the talk that I gave. I want to suggest also that modern science actually was birthed by Christianity. Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's got to start by these big guys, founders like Bacon and Galileo and Newton and Kepler. They could rely on regularity. They understood God created everything. God was logic. God was logical. God was ordered. So the universe would be that way. So you could study it. There would be a consistency behind the natural laws.
Which is it's crazy to think that there was a time where that wasn't just, of course.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like there was a time where it felt more like, no, the world's kind of not really ordered and it's a bit more chaotic. And that the idea that, no, there's an order to things and that there's a consistency to gravity and all these things, that was like explosion of,
Yeah, exactly. And that presupposition enabled them to really dig into stuff. Mm-hmm. The other thing I talked about is that there are two kinds of science. And when we do science, we're trying to discover what caused a particular effect. And science is this search for the cause. That's really what it is. So what caused the water to boil and so on and so forth. And I talked about two kinds of science. Operation science, which it can also be called empirical science, which involves repeatable events. So I can repeat over and over again that the water is going to boil at 100 degrees Celsius. Mm-hmm. There's a second kind called origin science, or what's also called forensic science, which involves historical events that you can't really repeat them. So you have to understand there's the distance or difference between them. And because there's those two different sciences, people will sometimes think, well, the repeatable science or the operation science is happening in forensic science or in origin science. It's not. So origin science is going back and looking at some things, but it's also extrapolating from what it's seeing things that it can't prove. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's just understanding those two is really important, because a lot of times, the truth of the matter is that the Christians and theists and atheists don't disagree on operation science. They're all in the same page.
Right, because
that's
just
origins.
that's just what you can observe and always is repeatable. So if you said, I don't believe you, well, I'll just show you.
Yeah.
Right? That's the operational. Yeah.
Yeah, but when it comes to the forensic science or the origin science, then there's a little bit of debate around that, because the Christians will say, no, I don't think that actually says that. I agree with what you're pointing out in terms of the evidence, but I think you're extrapolating to go in that direction. And there's other kinds of conflict that are going on there.
What would be an example? Because I don't know if I have my mind wrapped totally around the forensic. Can you think of an example of?
Basically what happened, if you could go back to the beginning of the universe, for example, that would be an act of forensic science. We can't go back and recreate the beginning of the universe again.
Okay.
We can't start life. We can't even look at how did life first start. We can examine life scientifically, but we can't say what started it. So forensic science is going back and saying, well, this is how the universe started, but it's a bit of a leap from the facts that you have to get there. And that's okay, just understand that that's what they're doing, and that's okay, as long as you understand the rules to the game.
So it's a bit of like an examination of a one-time event. Is that?
Whatever I can't go back and repeat.
Okay.
It fits into that idea of forensic science. I can't repeat the beginning of the universe. I can't repeat the starting of life, but I can. So I have to say, this is what life is like, but I can't understand how it started, but I'm going to suggest it started like this. As long as we understand that that's what it is, I think that's the important piece. Great question for sure. The other thing I pointed out was not only that, modern science was birthed by Christianity and the Bible and science are friends. There's two kinds of science, but I talked about the fact that many scientists are actually theists. So if you look at many of they're theists. I talked about in the teaching that Albert Einstein had 3 scientists on his walls. He had them all the way with him all the time, and they were Isaac Newton, Michael Faraday, and James Clerk Maxwell. Those 3 scientists were all strong believers in Jesus. They followed him tremendously, and they were like Einstein's heroes. But I also pointed out that science has its limits. Science doesn't deal with some of the really important issues in life, like who am I? Where did I come from? What's the meaning of life? Where am I going? They can't answer those questions. So it has limitations, and some people, I think, need to understand that it fits in a certain spot, but the Bible fits in a certain spot, and it's really important to understand the distinction between those two. Now, we got a lot of questions on this whole issue, and that was not a surprise. Here's one of the comments. Not only is there no conflict between God and science, this person writes, science provides strong evidence of God. The miracles are right in front of us. We are immersed in God's miracles. They're looking at the whole of creation and being stunned by it, and I think that's a great comment. Number 2, here's another question. You mentioned that the Grand Canyon was created by natural causes. Could it be that God created it from the beginning? And the answer, of course, is yes, it could be that way.
Sure.
But all creationists, even if they are, I'm going to use some terms I'll unpack a little bit later, young earth creationists or old earth creationists, both young earth and old earth believe that it was caused after creation. So young earth creationists will talk about the flood, Noah's flood, and say that the flood caused the Grand Canyon, and old earth creationists will argue, some of them might throw the flood in there, but some of them will say, well, it's over a long period of time that erosion took place. So it would be a rare thing to find someone saying that God created the Grand Canyon, but I appreciate the question. So there was another question that was asked, and it relates to the conversation we had about origins science and operations science. And the question was, on what basis do you make the distinction between operations and origins science? These are categories not recognized by any text I am aware of. And I got the categories from a book by a man named Frank Turek. The book is called Stealing from God. And I'm going to just read a section because I think it can be helpful in understanding this. He writes, but there are different atheist and theist theories on origin questions. In fact, let me back up. I'm going to go back up a little bit further because I think it's helpful. Atheists and theists are not arguing over the vast majority of scientific issues about how the world operates. There are not atheist and theist theories on how electricity operates to power your computer or how an engine operates to power your car. Those are settled matters that anyone can verify by observation and repetition. But there are very different atheist and theist theories on origin questions. They are more controversial because they cannot be settled by repeatable experiments in the lab. You can't go into a lab and observe the creation of the universe again or witness the origin of the first life or new life forms. While scientists can observe how a cell operates, they can't observe how the first cell originated. No scientist was there to witness it. The critical distinctions I'm making is that there are two types of science: operation science, which investigates repeatable questions, and origin science, which investigates historical questions. Sometimes these two types of science are called empirical and forensic. Choose whatever name you like, as long as this main difference is clear. Questions involving operation or empirical science involve repeatable events that you can observe in real time. Questions involving origin or forensic science involve historical events that cannot be repeated. And for that reason, operation science is usually more certain than origin science. So that's where that distinction kind of comes in there.
There's lots of good stuff that he said in there, particularly to just, if you do see this, like if your worldview is that it seem at odds, that you can really boil it down to the origin conversation, right? Yeah. Like, how am I reading the Bible and how am I thinking that the Bible talks about the origin? And then what is science, today's science, because it's always changing a little. What does it tell me about the origin? But yeah, that it doesn't really go into all of life.
No,
like
no.
These apparent contradictions.
Yes, just in that one area.
Yeah, the apparent contradictions, you can really boil them down to the origins place.
Yeah, exactly. And we had a lot of questions about the same sort of thing, and I'll just read a couple of them just to give you an idea. One thing that science and the Bible seems to be in conflict is about the age of the earth. Are you able to find common ground on these views? Another person writes, "Hi, the biggest question I get from my coworkers is, why does the Bible say the earth was created a few thousand years ago? Yet there's very clear scientific evidence that it's millions of years old. What's your perspective on this?" And we have a number of questions around that. Yeah. So let me dive into this one. This is I think it's a fascinating one. Unfortunately, it's been a divisive question or divisive question, depending on which country you come from. But you know what I'm saying? And that's really, it's really unfortunate. And I think a lot of us don't anyway, I better be careful. Let me go back in here. Let me just say this. So all theists are creationists. So anybody who believes in God believes that he created everything. They differ on how that happened. So sometimes we'll talk about young earth creationists, I already mentioned this, and old earth creationists. So young earth creationists see the universe as about 10,000, between 6 and 10,000 years old, and old earth creationists see it as being billions of years old, okay? 13.8, I think, is the newest number. Both young and old see science as supporting their position. So the young earth creationists see science as supporting a 10,000-year-old universe, and the old earth creationists see science as supporting a billions of years old universe. So the question then comes down to the interpretation of Genesis chapters 1 and 2. How do we understand that? And the young earth creationist sees that as a literal interpretation. So exactly what you see there, 6 literal 24-hour consecutive days the universe was created. Whereas an old earth creationist would look at the passage and say, I'm not sure it's to be interpreted literally. I think it may be a poem. I think it may be an illustration. I think it may be a parable. And there's others that are similar to that sort of format, just designed to help the children of Israel, having come out of Egypt, to understand that no, the sun isn't a god, and the water's not a god, that there's only one God, and he's the creator of everything, and what the Egyptians were worshiping are actually created objects. They aren't gods at all.
And the creation is good,
yes.
which remarkably, many religions don't actually espouse that.
Yes, true. That's true. That's true. So you have those two views, okay? And it's really interesting because early Christians, right up until about 1800, they had different opinions on what to do with Genesis. And it really, in fact, when Darwin came up with his theory of evolution, a lot of Christians weren't bothered by it because they really hadn't settled on understanding how Genesis actually took place. So from 1850 onwards, very few Christians were young earth, and that only became the prominent position in about 1960 with the coming of a book called The Genesis Flood, written by a guy named Whitcomb and Morris. And I actually studied that book at university in the States because it was a very strong statement that you can account for all of the geological formations and so on, and the fossilizations and so on, through the flood that came that would have compressed and made everything the way we see it today with all of that activity and so on and so on. So there are those two views that are out there, and Christians, some Christians are very, very bold and strong and committed to a young earth creation view, and generally what they'll do is say, you guys are messing up Genesis chapters 1 and 2, and old earth creationists are saying, no, you need to bring science into play, and science doesn't seem to support what you're saying, and young earths will say, no, science does support it. So you have these two views. I really wish that people would not draw lines over that view of Genesis chapter 1, and yet we tend to do that. And I know, having grown up through this and having studied it in my own way, that I have vacillated throughout my life. Sometimes I've been a young earther, and sometimes I've been an old earther, and so on and so forth. It is interesting to look back. You've got some heroes like Origen, who was a great theologian from Alexandria, Egypt, and he lived in the 3rd century, and Origen opposed the idea that the creation story should be interpreted as literal and historical. So he was against that. St. Augustine, who's a very famous guy, who early 5th century, we owe a great deal to him. He argues that the first 2 chapters of Genesis are written to suit the understanding of the people at that time in order to communicate it in a way that all people could understand. The creation story was told in a simpler allegorical fashion, but he definitely believed that God is the creator of it. He wasn't completely sure how it happened, but he was not so sold on it being a literal interpretation. St. Thomas Aquinas, the same kind of thing. Even John Wesley, who many people have heard of, he writes, the inspired penman in this history wrote for the Jews first, and calculating his narratives for the infant state of the church, describes things by their outward sensible appearances, and leaves us, by further discoveries of the divine light, to be led into the understanding of the mysteries couched under them. And you got other big heroes like B.B. Warfield, who was a big conservative, who fought for the inspiration of Scripture, and he did not also believe that you would interpret Genesis literally. Now, I think it's important, as I mentioned earlier, that we allow each other to wrestle through this one. Young Earth creationists are also saying that they can show that science supports their view. Old Earth creationists are saying they can show that science supports their view. Their view is that God created the universe. And as I mentioned in my teaching, sometimes we have to hold things loosely, and I think this is an area where we have to hold things loosely. There are a number of positions that people can have. I actually, for the longest time, I had a view that in what's called the gap theory, which basically states that there's a gap between Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1 and Genesis chapter 1 and verse 2. And basically what it says, Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, it says the earth was without form and void and darkness and all that. And you say, well, how did that happen? And gap theorists believe that there was a catastrophe that happened to this creation, and that chapter 1 and verse 2 and on is a recreation of a disaster that happened to the planet. So they're kind of a compromise position between young Earth and old. They believe it's old.
Hold on to all the pieces.
Yeah, they hold on to all the pieces. And I guess it's a great place to land. You keep everybody happy then. So that's kind of it. And in Creekside we got people who are all different opinions. Love Jesus. They're passionate about him. And I don't think it's an issue to divide over. Often when I talk this way, I'll get an email from somebody who says, I'm not going to stay at the church anymore because you don't believe the Bible. And off they go. And I wish they'd sit down and talk with me. And I think the biggest thing is that is 1960 when this became a really prominent thing. And I don't think people understand that book, The Genesis Flood by Whitcomb and Morris, was so powerful in what it did, and it created this kind of division.
Yeah, it's and I think hopefully what's helpful to you is to see two pastors not afraid of this issue and not afraid to say that there's these different camps, but that either one doesn't like there's no scientific discovery that could make us go, oh man, well that just blows up our whole faith. And that there's these commonalities that we believe, like the Genesis story unequivocally teaches God as creator. God as, it doesn't use the word love, but God's affection towards his creation. And creation is good. And we take those for granted. But those are huge in a world where you're just coming out of being a slave and you've been taught that, the gods are up there and they're angry at you and man, you want to escape. And they actually put, you're supposed to be a slave. All these other images. And then you get a story that says you, slave, bear the image of God. I'm like, wow, it blows it wide open. And so young Earth, old Earth, there's core things that we hold really, really foundational. And then, the other thing that you were saying is that oftentimes people will say, well, if we disagree on Genesis, then we might as well just disagree on the whole book. And boy, that is a wild place to take it. I mean, the foundation of Christianity is the resurrection. Not the interpretation of Genesis 1 and 2.
No. And clearly we've got a variety of interpretations throughout church history from the very, down through. It's not just, now people are becoming, now the accusation is now you're becoming liberal. No, you need to understand it's always been an issue throughout the history of the church, and some of these great leaders were holding to that particular state. And I guess the bottom line is we all believe that God created, we just are not sure about how. That's really the only thing, and doesn't really matter. This is God's creation. Look at it. It's beautiful. It's awesome. So here's another question. I know that not every question will have an answer, and that's okay, but if you have an answer, that would be great. How did dinosaurs fit in with creation? We know that they existed, and then they went extinct, but also that they would have existed many years before humans, but death only came into the world because of the fall of man. So where do dinosaurs play into things? Great question, and I will say that my understanding, and here's my understanding. So young Earth creationists will say dinosaurs existed, and what happened is that the flood came along, and it caused them to go extinct. For a number of reasons. There's a vapor canopy over the earth. It collapses on the earth. This is the Genesis flood book. Collapses on the earth, changes the temperatures on the planet. We now have a north and south pole instead of this greenhouse effect that these vapor barrier would have. And they die. They die because of the flood. They can't handle the temperature changes and so on and so forth. That was what the young earthers would say. And actually there's some... I'm going back a long way in my schooling here. The Paluxy River Valley in Texas apparently has a strata where there's human footprints and dinosaur footprints on the same strata. I don't know. There's some debate around that, and I'm not sure what recent archaeological digs have discovered, but that is an argument that you will see in the Genesis flood book around how that happened. So young earthers would do that. Old earthers would say, no, they died off for whatever reason. Could have been a meteor hitting the earth because they would see the earth as being a lot older.
You got lots of time for a lot of things to happen, right?
Yeah. And so that's how they would do that. And so when you're digging up the bones, the young earthers would say, well, that's because of the flood, and the old earthers would say, no, that's because of time or some catastrophe. So both of them, again, and this is my point, is that both young earthers and old earthers will believe the Bible and interpret Genesis 1 a little differently, but they'll also bring science in to try and resolve it. They're not pitching science aside, but they're trying to resolve it as they look at, try and understand this. And again, here's the cool thing, as you pointed out earlier, it's origin science that both young earthers and old earthers are using to try and understand Genesis with. And again, it's not the same as the other kind of, the origins.
So the real significant difference then is between a theistic view that says God created and we're not sure how, versus an attempt to use science to say there is no God.
Yes.
Right? That's the real difference.
Yeah, an atheistic view versus a theistic view for sure. So the other question, the final question here is, I said God is the author of the Bible because I was talking about God being the author of creation. God's the author of the Bible. How does that align with our understanding that it is a compilation of books and letters written by different writers? And you talked about this already. So I don't know that I need to deal with this question, except that we believe from 2 Timothy 3:16 to 17, all scripture is God-breathed and is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness, so that the servant of God may be thoroughly equipped for every good work. So we believe that God somehow works, as you mentioned, his spirit in the author, so that what gets written down is exactly what God wants written down. So that's how we end up with a book that we can trust. And it's act of faith for sure, but you did that great thing in the second week where you talked about, going back to Jesus. So I don't know that I need to say anything more than that.
Yeah, no, it's good. So,
but I can say this, that leads to our next real good question.
Yeah, so that leads us to our next question, which had to do with other religions. And so we framed it this way: how can Christianity claim it's right and all other faiths are wrong? And I spent a good deal of time, because it was true, just letting everybody know that this is a weird thing to say. It makes you feel kind of strange. I had the illustrate. I didn't say this in the sermon. I'll say this in this less formal setting. But I was like, when you believe this, it means that you think a certain thing when you drive by other religious places.
Yeah.
When you drive by a mosque, if you think this,
or when you see someone wearing clothing that's reflective of their religious beliefs.
Like it's just so countercultural.
Yeah.
It seems so incorrect to say this, and yet, as I said in the sermon, I think it's so important that we wrestle with this, and as followers of Jesus can get to the place where we can say this. And so I talked about that. Number one, Jesus clearly makes this claim.
Yes.
That he is the way. He's the way, the truth, the light, and that there's no other way. And so he makes it really clear. And so if you want to be his follower, this is the position that you have to take. Then I talked about how all truth claims are exclusive, and talked about the illustration of the elephant that often gets used as a can't you just see how all religions have a bit of the truth, and if we just stand back, but that in itself is a truth claim, and is making the claim that this perspective of just stepping back and being above all religions. Well, okay, now so that's your truth claim then, that you're somehow be able to see more than these religions that are thousands of years old. And so that's a really important thing to say, that if you feel uncomfortable making an exclusive truth claim, well, there's really no other way to form a worldview. Every religion, every belief, every worldview is going to make exclusive truth claims. Even if you say, no, mine is the most inclusive. Well, that has an exclusive aspect, because it's excluding the exclusive ones. And then I talked about that while the morality systems can sometimes appear to be the same, meaning wouldn't a good Christian and a good Muslim kind of look the same and have similar values? And sure, there are similar values, but they have very different images of who God is, and what God has done in the world, and why we exist, and the future that we are hoping for. So there's a whole. So when you think about the worldview, those are drastically different. And it is very. It's ignorant to try to lump them all together and say, well, they're all about the same.
It's not fair for me to tell you your religion is no different than that religion, no different than that religion. What do you mean it's no different? I mean, can't you at least respect the fact that I believe it's different? And you haven't looked close enough to see that it is in fact different, right? I think it's much more respectful to say it's different.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I talked about the image that Jesus gives us of who God is, that he is God in the flesh, and he points us to his Father, and that the God that he infleshes for us is so different than any other picture. And you can just use the word grace, the idea of grace that he teaches. And I use the prodigal son story, that the father in that story, there's no other religion that could tell that story and say, this is what God is like. And so there's just a beauty and a uniqueness to that. And then lastly, I made the point that while we say this, that the way that we carry this truth is vastly different as well. That we don't carry this truth with a sword, but we carry it the way Jesus did, which is to say, like Jesus before Pilate is like, I'm the truth, and everybody on the side of truth is with me, which is like his invitation to Pilate, like, you can join me, but I'm not going to make you, and I'm not going to do a magic trick for you either to convince you in this moment. So I think the way that we carry it, there's a humility to it, that we do believe that it's the way, and we will love you and die for you to maybe be able to see that. Right.
Good point.
Yeah. So that was the sermon, and then we got just a couple questions on. So the first question was this: many/all religions make exclusive claims that they are correct. And then the person says that Jesus claimed this is not unique to just Christianity, which is, I thought maybe I said that, but I guess they didn't hear it, that yes, it's true that Jesus makes this unique claim, and that many religions will make the same unique claim. So the point that I was trying to make was that Christianity then shouldn't be offensive for doing that. That was really what I was trying to say, is that Christianity says it's right and all other religions are wrong. And other religions make the same claim, and so it shouldn't be so surprising. I guess, that Jesus does that.
Don't pile up on one group and say they're really mean, bad people because they think they're right and everybody else is wrong. Well, no, we're all doing the same thing. Even the person who isn't a Christian believes their way is the right way, or they wouldn't be choosing it. So we're all exclusive in our own way. So let's just talk about which one is right or which one is better suited, that sort of thing, right?
Yeah, and then the thing that I did try to point to as the unique part was the character of God, why we're here, our final destiny that we hope for. Like, there are unique pieces, but the exclusive part isn't the unique part.
Yeah, I think the one thing that is also unique about Christianity, of course, is that it's grace. And that's quite different than all the other systems in the world, that God has done it for us. That the other religions, they spell them, getting right with whatever it is they need to be right with, as D-O, and Christianity spells D-O-N-E, done. So it's a grace thing, which I think is cool.
Yeah, you know what, when I listened to my talk back and I looked at my notes getting ready for this, I realized I had so much I wanted to say about that and didn't put it in, and I was surprised that I missed it, but that's such an important piece. Like, I knew I was going to talk about the grace piece, but I didn't contrast it the way that I wanted to with, do you realize all the other systems have either you're meeting God halfway, or you're going all the way, or you're at the end hoping that you did enough, off, and the whole scale thing. Yeah, that's such an important point. So the other question that we got around this topic was this: how can you use Jesus's comments that defend Christianity to non-Christians? So they're basically saying, one of the arguments that I made was Jesus is exclusive in his claims. They're saying, but if I'm talking to a non-Christian, how can I use Jesus because they don't listen to him? And so they say it doesn't appear to be a reasonable argument if they don't believe in Jesus to start with, which I guess, so I was wrestling with this a bit as far as, so you're talking to a non-Christian and you want to convince them of the exclusivity of Christianity. I don't know that there's any other way but to go to Jesus. I mean, to be a Christian is to be a Christ follower. And so I think that's natural. I don't know that there's an end around way to that.
No, I remember one time being in dialogue for actually quite a number of months with an atheist, and he came to a point where he said, well, I don't believe that Jesus existed.
Right.
And I said to him, then there's not really much point in our conversation, because I said, I can't go anywhere with that. I tried to, engage in a conversation around why I don't think that's a legitimate position to hold. I think there's lots of valid reasons why that doesn't make, to me anyway, sense. But I don't know where you go with that. I mean, if you're not going to listen, if you don't believe he existed, then how can you hear anything from him, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, that's part of what a series like this is trying to do is to say there are walls up for people. There's the challenging questions. And if we can give at least a reasonable, rational answer, that it might lower the wall or get that wall out of the way for then God, who is pursuing people, to get through. Because I think we go through life and maybe we build up these walls and we kind of like are fortified. We're like, nope, Jesus didn't exist. No, resurrection, stupid idea. And if we can at least present historical evidence, it's very plausible. Certainly he existed. Nobody's even refuting that anymore. But the resurrection, it's historically plausible. That maybe you there's a crack, and then the Spirit of God, who is pursuing everyone, gets in through that crack. But I mean, so I don't know that you can make a reasonable argument without going to Jesus' words. No. So, sorry.
Cool. That's good.
So that then leads to another real good question.
So the question I had was, doesn't Christianity take away personal freedom? Doesn't Christianity take away my personal freedom? If I follow this, I'm going to be in chains. I'm going to be held captive.
All these rules.
Yeah. And that is a big one for me, because I've talked to people and I'm feeling like, no, I'm not going to commit to that. I'm not going to commit, because committing means I'm going to give up my freedom. And I think that this is a big deal in our culture today, where freedom is the gateway to personal satisfaction and fulfillment and happiness and joy. And anytime I don't have the freedom to keep choosing what I want to choose, then I'm never going to be happy and satisfied and fulfilled. So this is the big thing. And in our culture, maybe bigger than at any other time that sociologists have looked at cultures and understood them. We really are into this. And we will, I'm going to be free of, we'll talk about just about anything I'm going to get free of so that I can experience the real me and I can find fulfillment.
Yeah. Even the lack of, you mentioned it, the lack of commitment or like aversion to commitment.
Yeah.
That's so huge. The first time that I heard the phrase cancel culture, and you hear a phrase and then you make up in your mind what it might mean. It doesn't mean this, but I thought that it meant the culture around people canceling plans because nobody wanted to commit to anything. And I thought that makes sense. We do live in a cancel culture. I think I lived with that as for half a year. I thought, we live in a cancel culture. No one wants to commit to anything. Anyways, keep going.
It's crazy. Yeah. So many of us have this ultimate value of freedom. If I can just get there, then I'm going to discover everything I need to be, right? But the problem is that our freedom is always going to be limited. And I talked about the fact that you didn't choose your height, your eye color, their parents, the context you're born in, the language, the race, anything. You're automatically not free from a whole lot of things, right?
Right.
And your freedom is always going to be limited. Much of our freedom comes from choosing, actually, not to be free. If you really want to be free in an area, if you want to be free to learn how to play the guitar, play the piano, or be a great athlete, you got to make commitments to say, I'm not free to, in order for me to be free to do this, I cannot be free to do that. And the greatest people who have accomplished the most amazing things in our culture, scientifically, socially, medically, whatever, have chosen not to be free so that they could be free to do some incredible things.
Yeah.
Our freedom is also connected to who we are. I already mentioned some of things around birthing that you didn't even choose that. But if you're like 4'6", you're never going to be a professional NBA player or
I thought that
WNBA
was hard.
player.
That was hard to hear. It was hard to hear, Ken. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, who you are, what's your personality like, what is all that? So you have to figure out who am I as a person to really be free. A train is most free when it stays on its tracks. A fish is most free when it's in the water. That's the environment that fits what it is. And for human beings, it's really important for us to understand that. Christianity comes along and actually claims to offer a rich personal freedom experience. And there are many, many verses in the Bible, many statements that Jesus has made, like, then you'll know the truth will set you free. If the Son sets you free, you're going to be free indeed. It's for freedom that Christ has set me free, Paul says. And I could go on. So the Bible really talks about that. But freedom from Jesus' point of view is an experiential, he offers an experience of it to us. In the passage that everybody on the planet, or everybody on the planet, but many, many people know is, then you'll know the truth and the truth will set you free. We quote that in movies and in books and everything in our culture.
So just tell the truth. That's what it means, right?
Yeah,
just
yeah. Well,
Stop
actually,
lying.
they're ripping it out of Jesus. They don't even know Jesus was the one who came up with it, right?
Yeah.
Jesus says, if you hold to my teaching, you're truly my disciples, then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. In other words, Jesus says, if you do what I say, you're going to discover a freedom that's deeper and bigger and wilder and more wonderful. It's like the train on the tracks and the fish in the water, if you'll understand and grab hold of that. And I think that's so cool. He's saying you'll experience this freedom, and we talk about some of the wonderful ways that can happen in our lives, right? Your attitudes can change. You'll discover this whole freedom when have you ever forgiven somebody and then felt the freedom of forgiveness? Have you ever confessed a sin and then felt the freedom of confession? Like all of those things that Jesus talks about really bring us freedom. And then I said the love is the greatest expression of freedom. And so my initial question was, doesn't Christianity take away personal freedom? And the answer is yes and no. Yes, it does take away personal freedom. In the same way that you love someone, and by loving that person, you restrict yourself in that relationship. And love is the greatest kind of relationship of joyful freedom that you can have. So yes, it restricts. But no, Christianity doesn't take your freedom away, because you're choosing to love God back again. When you choose to love God back, that's your choice. That's your act of freedom. He doesn't want you to love him for any other reason than that you so see him as the one who loves you. You so understand what Jesus has done that you, out of your freedom, choose to follow him and discover then that then you know the truth, and the truth will truly set you free.
And the Christian worldview is that we are not currently free, right? That we are slaves to sin. And that's why the Exodus story is so powerful as one of the major themes that weaves its way throughout the rest of the Bible, is a God who sets us free.
Yes.
Who finds slaves and sets them free.
Yes.
And so I don't know if you used it in the sermon or not, but when Paul says there's things that I want to do that I don't do, and there's things that I don't do and I want to, like, Paul's wrestling with this, like, I'm not free.
Yeah.
And I find that idea is so helpful to people, whether you're a Christian or not. Like, don't you find it's true that you wanted to get up at 6 a.m. and work out and then eat good all day, and you couldn't do it?
Yeah.
Isn't that fascinating? And I mean, it's just, you can apply that to the rest of life. But so it comes from a worldview that says you're not free. God wants to set you free from sin, and that is the reason why you would love him. I mean, that's that display of his love for you.
Yeah.
Makes you then want to say, oh, I'd love to give up some of my freedom to serve him.
Yes. And that's a free choice. That is an experience of freedom when you love somebody else, but it does, there's a price to it, and that's the way it goes. So here's one of the questions. We only had one. What can Christians say to people who leave Christianity for the freedom to do whatever they want? What can we say to people who I just want to be free to do this? And I think it relates to everything we've already said, and something that you were just talking about as well, that when you choose you can choose to do anything else, and you can say, let me just back up a little bit here. You have the freedom as a human being to reject God or accept God. That's the way he's wired you up. And that's a beautiful, God doesn't force you into that thing. But there's a freedom that you will miss if you leave Christianity. There's the freedom of knowing that you're in a right relationship with your Creator. There's the freedom of knowing that your sins have been dealt with. There's the freedom of discovering that you've got this God who's with you all the time, that he speaks to you and walks with you. And all of that, I think, is so very, very important. And, I think I'd want to talk to the person who said, well, I'm going to leave it because it's not freeing. I'm going to discover this freedom over here. And I'd say, well, what kind of freedom? What are you looking for? What are you after in life? And I do think this is a pattern that a lot of people engage in, where they'll leave Christianity because I don't want to be in this love relationship with God anymore because I find that there's requirements to be in a love relationship. It is limiting, as I said. That's true. And I don't know. I think you just have to say, well, what are your options? Where are you going? What are you going to experience if you don't follow him? Let's ask the questions here.
Yeah, it's the prodigal, right?
Yeah.
I don't feel like I'm free here. I want to leave, Dad.
Good point.
And the father's like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
And then he realizes I was so much better back home.
Yeah.
And so I think if I was in a relationship with someone that I loved and they were telling me, I think, I don't want to do the church thing anymore, and I would maybe just encourage them to, like, okay, as you engage in this new freedom that you think just stay close to Jesus.
Yeah.
And listen and see if there's actually peace there.
Yeah.
Because our assumption, our thinking around it would be that you're going to go into something that you think is free and is going to be a new form of peace, and that it won't be there. Yeah. It'll be a false hope that it's a mirage, and you're going to get there and you're going to be like the prodigal who looks back and go, oh, now I can see it.
Yeah.
And yeah.
I mean, if Jesus is making these large statements about, if the Son sets you free, you'll be free indeed, and you're not feeling free, then maybe you have a misunderstanding of who it is that Jesus is, and you're not really discovering the fullness of what it means to follow him. And if you're kind of cheating in that relationship, or you're kind of fading on the outside, then no wonder you don't feel it. Let's talk about how you need to live your life to experience the full freedom that he offers us.
That's good.
And that leads us to our next real good question.
Yeah, so the next question dealt with the problem of evil. And so I worded it this way. You can word it lots of different ways. But how can we believe in a good, loving, and all-powerful God when there is evil and suffering in the world? And so this is maybe one of the oldest questions.
It's a great one.
And so I pointed out that everybody has to wrestle with this, no matter what worldview, what religion you want to be a part of. You still got to deal with what do I make of evil and suffering? And so you can go with some type of God figure who's allowing this, no God, but you gotta figure out an answer.
What makes something evil if there is no God?
Of some sort.
There's all kinds of questions around it. Yeah, it's a tricky one.
Yeah, and so I talked about, and I did this intentionally really quickly, that there's greater good arguments that I could have spent the whole sermon on, but I said by the end of wrapping those up that I find them not to be super compelling or to be the thing that brings peace. And so you can defer to the greater good. There's the free will idea. There's for the glory of God, that this creation puts on display all the fullness of his attributes. That would be kind of the way the argument goes. Or that our growth, that somehow for us to be able to grow, that this is the type of environment that we grow in. But ultimately, that's just one piece of the furniture that I think that you need in your mind, that, okay, there's this greater good, but that it doesn't quite satisfy. And so then we looked at the book of Job. And I kind of framed it as the book of Job pushes us past the question of why and pushes us into who is this God.
Right.
That Job has this experience of God. He's overwhelmed by the presence of God, and that has him basically put down his why questions. And it says that he repents, which he changes his mind, and then the book kind of ends, and then he's restored. And so I looked at the book, and my interpretation of it was to say that it's intentionally pushing us past why and into the character of God. Who is this God? And for Job, it's more of an experience of his power and his this is kind of, it's a theophany. It's like a display of God in the natural world, and so he experiences God, and then just as a powerful God. But for us as Christians, we have the benefit of having much more revelation of who this God is. And so the God that Job sees is also the God that is revealed to us in Jesus. And Jesus comes to reveal to us a God who loves us to the point of entering into our suffering with us and then suffering for us on the cross. And that when you get that picture of who this God is, that God then promises to be with us in our suffering, that people have found that that's enough. Mm-hmm. And if you've never experienced that, that can feel like but why? Like, I just want to go back to the why, and I want to ask more questions. But when you experience walking with Jesus, and then you enter into suffering or evil, and you feel his presence, there is this that's the answer. Like, he's here, and that this is enough, and that somehow these can be reconciled. That this good, loving God, all-powerful God exists, and he allows this world of evil and suffering to continue. But because he's entered into it, and that he's with us and walks with us through it all, that's enough. It's enough to bring us peace. And so Yeah, that was kind of what the sermon was about.
No, it was great. It was a great sermon. And, the whole idea that evil and suffering was something that Jesus experienced too, right? I mean, God's not aloof from that experience that we're going through. He understands that he's been through it in the person of Jesus. And I think that's a critical piece as well, for sure. Yeah.
So we got two questions. They're very different. The first one is, I know what God has done for me, and even though I forget it sometimes, I know that he is with me. And then they ask, but is it enough to say, how long, Lord? Will those of color be hurt by people in authority in another country or in our country? How long, Lord, will groups fight and kill in your name? How long do we ask, how long? And so at the end of the sermon, I talked about shifting from always asking the why question to asking the question that we find in the Psalms, which is how long, which is a question of faith. It's a question of trust to say, God, I believe that you're all powerful. I believe in the end that you will come and bring justice and healing and restoration. So instead of asking why or are you there, I'm going to ask, how long are you going to allow this to go on for? And so they're asking, is that enough?
Yeah. How long do I ask? How long? Right.
Yeah. Which is great, because I think that you should definitely also say, maybe I should have added this to the sermon, we are those who fight for justice in the here and now while we pray, how long? And so there is but at the same time, there's a realization that we can't ultimately fix it. We can't bring the end about on our own. And so we fight against injustice here and now as we cry out, Jesus, would you come and fully eradicate it and bring the new creation that you promised?
Yeah, and I think how long is a real call for faith in God, right? You're saying, how long? I know you're going to do something right one day, God. How long? And, that's a cry in the book of Revelation as well. So it's all the way throughout the Bible that when there's pain and evil and suffering, that people are crying out, how long, God? And I think that's where you look. I think it's a prayer. I think it's a cry of faith that you believe that God is the answer to this. So it sort of bolsters that inside your spirit. And I think that that's really critical as well. And we wait for the answer, which will be the right answer, the true answer, the best answer. But for generation after generation, it's a cry that I think we need to utter.
Yeah.
Good point.
Yeah, so great question, though. Great point that they brought out.
Very.
Then the second question, it's got some assumptions that we're not sure about, but I'll read it and then we'll talk about it. So the second question is, why trust in God? He killed tons of people, including his own son, and the devil only killed 2 people. So they're reading the Bible and they're noticing that it seems like God is being attributed with the deaths of many people, and even his own son, according to their reading, and that the devil only killed 2, which we had some discussion around, like, which 2 are because we're not sure who he's referring to, and I think we have a different view on it.
Is it Adam and Eve that he's referring to? And if so, he actually killed everybody. But anyway.
So, but the heart of the question, I think, is why trust in this God?
Yeah.
And so to me, that just leads us back to Jesus, that the full revelation of this God is found in Jesus. And Jesus makes it so clear that he and his Father love us to the point of suffering with us and for us. And that this is a God who delights in giving life, who delights in setting people free, and that there is another force at work in the world, we call him the Satan, who delights in destruction and in our death. And so there's always lots of wrestling as you read through it, particularly the Old Testament accounts of these warring tribes and God's action. And I think you'd have to go text by text to really do it justice.
I think so, yeah.
So rather than just say, God kills tons of people, that's quite a wild thing to have to answer instead of going text by text. And maybe we'll do a series one day. It'll be called God kills tons of people? Question mark. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it is a hard one too, though. It is one of those questions that's really hard to answer. And I mean, I've done some reading on it, and people have written whole books about it, and it's hard. But I think that, I sometimes think, now if I was writing the Bible, I wouldn't have included that, okay? Because I want to make God look better than I think he looks in this particular context. But clearly, God wants us to see that that's also part and parcel of his action in the world. And again, I don't have a really, really super good answer for it, but I do believe that when you look at Christ, as you've said, that we see how much he took the evil and suffering on himself to take care of our biggest need, which was our sin and our distance from him.
Yeah. So that's our last question, and that concludes this podcast. And so we would love to know what you think of this, however you got this content. So subscribe, all that stuff, comment down below. We'd love to know what you think. And maybe if you like this, if this is helpful, then you'll see us again in this format.
Could be.
Yeah. See ya.
God bless.